So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Richard Brethour-Bell. I am the Vice President of Accessibility, Diversity, and Inclusion for InterPride. And today we're going to talk about cultural competency versus cultural humility as part of our Rainbow series, our Rainbow Racism series. This series is about addressing racism and biases that take place within queer spaces. Um, and today I am joined with two other board members of InterPride, and I'll have them introduce themselves. Let's start with Marsha, please.
Hi, I'm Marsha Levine, and I'm the Vice President of Global Outreach, one of four. And I'm glad to be here with Richard and Nicholas.
And Nicholas, introduce yourself, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicolas Rodriguez. I live in El Salvador. I'm as a VP of InterPride and Global Outreach too.
Awesome. I am so glad that both of you are here to have this discussion. I think it's important to talk about the different cultures that make up our community, that makes up our organization, and it makes up our society, and the appreciation of those cultures, and the importance of being culturally aware as well as self awareness of one's own culture. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we'll define cultural competency and cultural humility. We'll set personal goals for moving from cultural competency to cultural humility and develop a common understanding of the principles of culture. Culture means different things to different people. It's a shared system of values and beliefs, a way of seeing the world or world lens, learned pattern of behavior, ever changing socially framed, expressing in views, attitudes, and behaviors, sometimes referred to in categories, often individually defined. Cultures can be ethnic, religious, age, gender, sexual orientation, professional, educational, geographic, formed by social circumstances, homelessness, special interests, socioeconomic level. So, culturally competent means to communicate with and effectively interact with people across cultures. Cultural competence encompasses being aware of one's own worldview, developing positive attitudes toward culture differences, gaining knowledge of different culture practices and worldviews, developing skills for communication and interaction across cultures. Marsha, let me start with you because, as one of the founders of this organization and someone who is in San Francisco, incredibly diverse community, how do you recognize and move through the different cultures that you're surrounded by, as well as being aware of your own culture?
I think that over time I've learned that you have to not center yourself, and you have to open yourself more to other people around you, listen to what they have to say, and learn from them, and that way you become more aware of all the different facets of culture around you.
Hmm. And Nicholas, could tell us about the many different cultures of El Salvador.
Well, we learned that specific in El Salvador. Um, Normally, when you be in El Salvador, you learn about different culture when you have the opportunity, or sort of to say the privilege, to walk outside of the border. When you meet people from another part of Central America, you recognize that you are Latino, you are a Central American too. In fact, you was part of the same country centuries ago, but you recognize that difference when you cross the borders and say we are brothers, we are sisters, but we have difference. And the problem in El Salvador is if you always live inside El Salvador, it's hard for a person in El Salvador to recognize that difference. And that is the reasons because even though in our history We had a recent civil war in the 80s. It's mean even being the same people living in the same country, we start a war between brothers because we don't recognize our difference.
Mhm. Understandable. Marsha and I are both Americans, and America often brags about being a melting pot and being accepting of so many different cultures, but clearly we have issues. Oftentimes when we are part of cultures that are different from our own, and so we need to work on that. We talked about cultural competency, and that's basically an awareness of your own culture and the cultures that differ from yours. But culture humility is a little different. Cultural humility is a personal lifelong commitment to self evaluation and self critique. So you realize that it is a lifelong process of learning about other cultures. It's recognition of power dynamics and imbalances and a desire to fix those power imbalances and to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. So, you might be part of an organization that requires you to take a cultural competency workshop or class. But cultural humility is different because that's more personal. But then we also have institutional accountability. So if cultural humility is about a lifelong journey of learning about other cultures and addressing power imbalances, then how are we a part of that? So let me direct this back to you, Marsha. Um, as one of the members of InterPride, an international organization of pride organizers, how can this organization encompass cultural humility?
Wow, that's a big question. Um, it really goes back to what I said in my first answer. It's listening and making yourself aware to other people around you. Um, that's been probably the biggest takeaway for me in the my most recent history with the organization, especially as we've interacted with more people around the globe. Back in the beginning, when we were more US based, it was just, I suppose, sort of assumed we were all alike or similar because we had that in common. But as the organization has expanded in its membership out internationally, you do become aware of differences even in language that is used during meetings. You have to find something that's less US centric and more globally accepted.
And let me add something about Marsha says. Can I say it, Richard?
Of course.
I see when with my own eyes that change that Marchas is speaking about InterPride. I was become a member in 2018, and now in 2022 I see the huge difference, the big changes that the InterPride did. Now it's more universally, more globally in terms of diversity in the board and the practices, and even these efforts to give the message of enterprise in different language.
Hmm. Absolutely. Being a part of Enterprise for well over a decade now, I have seen this change in um, embracing more cultures and being aware of our own cultures um, and this continued learning process. And the whole point of cultural humility is that it's not a one and done. This is a lifelong journey. But education, becoming aware, should be a lifelong journey. We should never get to the point where we feel like, oh, well, we learned all we need to learn, so it's time to move on. But also, cultural humility is about addressing the power imbalances, um, and doing something about that, creating accessibility, making room at the table for others who have been historically left out. And I agree with you, Nicholas. It looks like that InterPride has really been trying to do that. So a little bit more about practicing cultural humility. This is Nicole Cook, and she is an associate professor of the School of Library and Information Sciences at the University of South Carolina. She said that each community is distinct and has its own needs. There are also communities within communities, all of which deserve recognition. And she mentioned that cultural humility stretches the idea of cultural competence to not only recognize power dynamic and imbalances, but to redress these imbalances. So, Nicholas, let me start with you. What are some additional ways that we as leaders in this organization can recognize the power dynamics and imbalances and actually do something about it? What do you think?
I think that, well, uh, there's some many things, but I prioritize the fact that as an organized and as a person, to achieve the goal to understand how the other people think is try to have this always this open mind and sort of to say a positive way of thinking what you're hearing about the other person, the people, what you are talking in this in a dialogue. For example, we have a conversation in this moment, the three of us, but English is not my native language, and I'm doing the effort to translate to Spanish to English what I'm trying to say. And maybe in this translation, maybe I could make a mistake of translation. And if the other person is hearing and doesn't have this in advance, this idea of being positive, being this person's trying to explain me very well, and that person maybe say something wrong or hear wrong, the you can say, oh, what he's trying to say, maybe he's trying to say a different thing that we are talking about. So this is an example that try to put, we say in Spanish, try to put in the foot of the other person. I try to
Mhm,
understand, to have a very comprehensive way of he's trying to say it.
mhm. Absolutely. I do really think it's important to try to understand the motives of another person instead of just jumping to a conclusion based on our own personal culture and how that translates to us. So I absolutely agree with you. Also, uh, your English is way better than my Spanish. So
Thank you.
so yeah, I can have a conversation with you. If I tried to have a conversation with you in Spanish, you wouldn't know what I was talking about. Marsha, as
Great.
it, how how do you think that we can redress power imbalances within our organizations, or this organization and the pride organizations that we're a part of?
I'm definitely no expert in coming up with solutions about that. I I feel like some of us are at the bottom rung of the ladder learning about all this stuff that we don't necessarily have those answers. I think there's steps to sort of do that play on the ladder thing that that you can take. Some of them are financial, some of them, in addition to the awareness aspect that we've already talked about, is a step. There's there's I know that we've had discussions as an organization about how we can make even attendance at our conferences be a little bit more equitable. And while the pandemic hasn't actually allowed us to do that much in the last couple of years, that doing virtual or Zoom kind of meetings has at least given a measure of equitable accessibility to the organization, to the topics we have to discuss, to each other.
Hmm. Absolutely. I know that when it comes to trying to create a more diverse community, a more diverse organization, oftentimes people will say, well, we don't know how to get women involved, how to get minorities involved, um, trans individuals involved. Um, but we know we have to meet people where they are. So you have to ask yourself, have you been to a Black Pride or a Latino Pride, where you can have communication with leadership there and see how we can come together, and get these individuals part of our community so they can participate in the education process that we're endeavoring. Those are some of the things that we have to do when we talk about providing a seat at the table. We don't wait for people to come find us. We go out and try to find them, and the only way to do that is really to learn more about their cultures, and we do that by going to where they are, where they assemble, where they meet, where they congregate, those kind of things. So understanding cultural competence and cultural humility. Cultural competence is gaining cultural knowledge, is developing cultural self-awareness. Cultural humility is holding systems accountable, understanding and addressing power imbalances. So it's not enough to just say, um, you know, we've learned what we need to know about other cultures. Now, how do we go about um, righting the wrongs that have taken place, filling voids that have become part of some of our communities? Cultural competence and cultural humility require developing cultural self-awareness, becoming aware of your own cultural norms, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, identifying and examining your own personal bias and stereotypes and prejudices. This is extremely important. Um, I I hear people say, "Oh, I don't have a racist bone in my body," or "I'm colorblind," or "I don't see colors," those kind of things. We are in a society where we are bombarded by information from the media, from teachings that are racially insensitive, that are culturally insensitive. And if that is the case, how is it possible for us, any of us, to walk away without some biases and some stereotypes, some prejudices? So that's why the self-awareness part of cultural competence is so important. Consider the impact a cultural difference might have on your interactions, BIPOC, and that is Black and Indigenous people of color, and their families in their communities. Gaining cultural knowledge and the importance of lived experience. Marsha, let me ask you, we all know in order to become more culturally aware and learn about different cultures, we really have to embrace lived experience. Um, so when people from different cultures and different backgrounds relate their stories, relate their experiences, it's important to validate that. So how do you do that in a leadership role?
You really have to create opportunities for people to tell their stories. It's not, it can't always be a one-way street where you are putting out information to people without taking information back in.
Mm,
It's it definitely has to be a shared conversation instead of one way.
absolutely. And Nicholas, we know that attending cultural events and festivals and establishing contacts and relationships and confidants and community visits are important to our cultural competence. How are you doing that in a leadership role in your either with InterPride or with your own Pride organization.
Well, in let me put an example, interesting example, that when we gather the volunteers in the El Salvador Pride, for example, we when we speak with the facilitators who will speak with all the crew of the volunteers, we say, remember that we uh, the the total amount, the total of the volunteers come from many part of the country. So let's maintain a respectful chat, and for example, not using, for example, Salvador, the people of the capital city, we have a very sarcastic way of casual talking, and we say, do not use this sarcastic way because other person can feel that this sarcasm will be harmful. And I say that because, for example, the first time that I visit USA, I was in some cities that sarcastic is a way of speaking, and by myself, when
Mhm.
people chat me friendly but with that sarcastic, and I feel harmful. In fact, my first night in United States, I cried twice because I feel harmful, and for sure that person doesn't want it to mean it, but it was a sarcastic way. So try to not reproduce this. I talk with the crew and say, please, are very extremely respectful, casual talking, because you don't know if the other person will feel damage in his feeling, even if you think, no, that is usually no. Always avoid that.
Mhm. Absolutely agree. What we want to do now is we're going to talk about self awareness. This is just for each of us and our listeners personally, our own personal evaluation. So, what we're going to do is ask some questions about our awareness. And either you can write this down or keep a mental check. Um, each question I want you to ask yourself, is this true of you or is it never true of you? Is it often or is it always true of you? And just keep this mental accounting of the points in your head, or if you're going to write it down, and then we'll discuss a little bit afterwards. But this is just some food for thought for us. So, the first question is, how do you value diversity? Do you view human differences as positive and a cause for celebration? Do you know yourself, have a clear sense of your own ethnic, cultural, and racial identity? Do you share your culture, aware that in order to learn about about cultures, you need to understand and be prepared to share your own culture? If this is not a practice of yours, give yourself 1 point, sometimes 2 points, often 3 points, always 4 points. Are you aware of discomfort? Aware of your own discomfort when you encounter differences in race, color, religion, sexual orientation, language, or ethnicity? You're aware of the assumptions that you hold about people of cultures different from your own? Are you aware of your own stereotypes as they arise and have developed personal strategies for reducing the harm that they cause others? If this is never the case with you, 1 point, sometimes two, often three, always four. Accept ambiguity, accept that in cross-cultural situations there can be uncertainty, and that uncertainty can make you anxious. It can also mean that you don't respond quickly and take the time needed to get more information. Be curious. Take an opportunity to put yourself in places where you can learn about difference and create relationship. And you will make mistakes and will learn from them. So you will gain from your mistakes. Is this never true of you? 1 point, sometimes two, often three, always four. You will recognize that the knowledge of certain cultural groups is limited and commit to creating opportunities to learn more. You're aware that in order to learn more about others, you need to understand and be prepared to share your own culture. You're aware of your discomfort when you encounter differences in race, color, religion, sexual orientation, language, and ethnicity. 1 point for never, sometimes two, often three, always four. Check your assumptions. You're aware of the assumptions that you hold about people of cultures that are different from your own. Challenge your stereotypes. Are you aware of your stereotypes and they arise and have developed personal strategies for reducing the harm they cause? If this is never the case with you, 1 point, sometimes 2 points, often three, always four. So obviously, the more points that you have accumulated, the more culturally competent you are, the more culturally aware in your endeavor for cultural humility or your practice for cultural humility. Um, so let me start with you, Nicholas. Do you see areas based on your answers where you need to do some additional work?
Yes, totally, totally. I see of all the four, uh, five slide that I saw. There's two slide that I need to do more.
Mhm. And how about you, Marsha?
Definitely as well. It's especially, I would say, in the last 2 or 3 years become more apparent just how much more learning there is that needs to be done. As you said at the beginning, you're not a finished person at some point, and that's it. And um, I love people who say things like, "Oh, I'm too old to learn anything new," and it's just not true. I will speak to that as an older person. You can learn if you want to, just by opening yourself up and seeing beyond your own boundaries.
That is so true. I have to make this joke about an episode of The Real Housewives of New York that I saw. Don't judge me. But there was an endeavor to teach some of the ladies about different cultures. And one of the women said, sometimes we don't want to be educated. And it's funny, but it's also true. There are those who say, listen, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to talk about it. Can we just have fun and get along? But we all know that if we don't deal with the issues that have caused it, that causes division between us, then we have no hope of bridging a gap. So it's important to endeavor to take on that lifelong education, that lifelong awareness, so we're not stuck, that we can create a better community, create better society.
Maybe,
So go ahead, Marsha.
sorry to interrupt.
No.
Maybe society back way back, it was okay to be superficial and just get along and be friendly and not have to do that deep diving into something else other than the what you know or your own. But I mean, look at all the reality that we've had to deal with in the last few years. 4 years of Trump, violence against black and brown people, 2 years of pandemic. It's been a lot to take in, but it's also been another jump in our societal growth as
Mhm.
well too, as much as some of those experiences are extremely negative.
Absolutely.
And that is true. And, maybe we sort of to say we make the mistake that We think if one group, for example, if the LGBT community is sometime there's a group who say, well, if you are LGBT, you have this specific political position, this specific opinions about this issue, about this topic, and that is not true. Even in the LGBT community, is completely huge and diverse the spectrum of the political thought.
That is absolutely true. And we see that because we talked about dealing with communities within communities, that kind of thing. And you're right, we're not a monolith, whether we're African Americans, whether we're Latinos, Jewish, we're not a monolith. We don't all feel the same way. And that's one of the important lessons in learning or becoming more aware of different cultures. You know, as you mentioned, in the United States, for example, you know, people are shocked when there are Black conservatives or when there are Latino conservatives. You know, it's shocking to people, or LGBT plus conservatives. And yet, we all know they're there. And it can be disheartening because it feels like, well, you're fighting against our own community instead of helping us to grow and creating more accessibility. You're fighting against our own, community. But people are very much affected by their personal culture, which also includes, their religion, as we talked about. Um, it might include the philosophy of the socioeconomic community that they're a part of. There are many factors to make up our different political viewpoints and our social viewpoints. And simply, our race or sexuality or religion is not the sum total of that. And yeah, we need to be aware of that if we're going to have any hope of growing and evolving as a human being, as human beings, as well as a society.
And plus like that, and plus like that, you said many times a person have position not just or not only for their beliefs, maybe something is pressure. For example, I know in North American United States, every person can have a official can say his position about some topic publicly without problems. But for example, in situations in places like mine, El Salvador, uh, many years ago we have liberty of speak. Now, if you have a position about against or actually government, we can go to jail, maybe if we say something about against the president. And this kind of pressure mm, sometimes makes people say something in public that not necessarily is his belief.
Hmm. Absolutely. So when we talk about culture humility, right now, in the United States, I'm sure in other nations, but it's almost shocking in a democracy to see this. But there are people. We have Florida "Don't Say Gay" law now, and we can be sure there are other states, particularly southern states, that are going to follow. In the United States, studying the history of race and racism, and understanding how it disproportionately impacts people of color, is how we redress power imbalances. Completing racial equity training, learning to develop and evaluate culturally relevant and appropriate programs, materials, and interventions. These are all part of cultural humility. And humility is marked by modesty and not arrogance or pride. And it's important that cultural humility is about personal and interpersonal and institutional transformation. So it shows that it goes a lot further than saying, "Oh, we need to do better" or "we should do better," those kind of things, but actually putting things in place so that we could see that our organizations, our communities do a better job of redressing power imbalances. It requires humility, it requires dialogue, um, and it requires to create communities of dialogue. And that goes back to what we were saying before about um, communities within communities. And that is very much a part of the queer experience, multiple communities within the queer community. So, Nicholas, with being in a leadership role at InterPride, what are some ways that you can recognize um, different communities that are taking place within our queer spaces?
Uh, can you repeat me the question, please?
Sure. Three of us are kind of in leadership roles in this organization. And we talked about earlier the importance of recognizing communities within communities. So, for example, we might talk about the different issues of Indigenous people or Black people or Latino people that takes place within queer spaces. How can we do a better job of recognizing that?
One of the things that surprised me, that when I visit another pride events around the world, I discovered that, for example, the festivals have these stage for main stage, these Latino stage, these um, indie space. In I think these are really good practical in events, because many people may think, oh, but this is division. No, it's not division. It's showing all the time of the event the different faces of our community. So I think this kind of actions in the events to visi- makes visibility all the expression of the music, for example, of expression of art, makes that you can be in an action in a pride event, and at the same time showing how diverse we are.
Absolutely. I saw that with attending um, Toronto Pride. They had, and such a good example, Nicholas, because they had a people of color stage part of it where you could go and see the different cultures from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Black Canadians. And it was such a powerful display of how we can bring this together. Marsha, San Francisco Pride is a huge pride, and you get visitors from all over the world. How are you recognizing um, communities within communities?
We have over 20 community stages.
Wow.
So some of them are definitely community based, like the Latin stage and the Solar Pride, which is predominantly Black. But we also have the women's stage, the Leather Alley, Freedom Ferry Village. So there's all different kinds of cultural experiences there. And while I think that's a great opportunity to learn a lot in a very focused way, I'm also a big advocate for pulling those cultures, those music genres, however you group the stages onto the main stage, so the people who don't wander around and get that experience can also get it from the main stage.
That is a very important point, Marcia. It's great to have these other stages, but your only, you know, opportunities to see different cultures shouldn't be that you have to go to these different stages.
Right.
You should be able to see diversity and inclusion on the main stage. So yeah, I think it's a good idea to have those other stages, but you know, we certainly don't want to lose the importance of coming together and recognizing
And I want to add
different cultures.
something.
Go ahead, Nicholas.
Not only the festival. I think it's important that in the march at itself see that diversity, because for example in many part of the world, the march, well, we always say it's a march, but everyone has his own expression of how celebrate pride. And for many it's important that always give the space that if one person use the march to protest, to make an statement, uh, well, that is the moment. Not all the people goes to celebrate and go as with music and dancing in the street. Many people go with his microphone, um, expressing his what they think about what is bad about the laws in their countries against LGBT population. So always is important. Always check that every every expression of the people in the march will be validated.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that these marches are not just a celebration, but it's a protest, and it's a protest against injustice. So, very valid point, Nicholas. So, this is George A. Miller. He's a professor of psychology at Princeton, or used to be. And this is something that has stuck with me, and I am trying to incorporate this in my listening and understanding of others. He said, listens if the speaker is wise. And that's kind of hard, that that can be difficult to understand. He said, to understand what another person is saying, you must assume that it is true and try to imagine what it could be true of. And I thought that was so important. We go that goes back to understanding the motivation of someone else, especially if this is someone of a different culture than yours. Where are you coming from with this? But assume that this person knows exactly what they're talking about. And instead of feeling like what they're saying is wrong based on your culture, try to understand from their perspective that what they're saying is true. That can be a challenge, but I do think it's something that we can rise to. Um, critical self-reflection and lifelong learning. This is, as we talked about the application of cultural humility, we realize that you have to know yourself, you have to know your own culture. I think it's important to recognize how that culture has contributed to division in a society that we live in. That doesn't mean that's for you to feel guilty. uh, I don't think anybody wants someone else to feel guilty, but it is about recognition. In what ways are you bringing your identity, power, and privilege to the table? Something we can ask, all of us can ask ourselves. Can you listen respectfully and quiet in order to determine how best to foster effective communication? No laundry list of cultural traits to check off, which personally I just can't stand this. Well, I do this and I do that and I've done this. And well, great for you. But that's not what cultural humility is about. Kind of losing fact or losing a point of humility in that. But more importantly, and Marsha, you've pointed this out, are you listening? That is extremely important. Listening and creating the conditions for community voice. In order to recognize the importance of lived experience, we really have to listen and we have to create space for people um, to be heard. So we also talked about the importance of uh, inequity. I mean, addressing inequity. This is an image that shows that it's not enough to just say, okay, we have equality. As you can see, they both have the same size ladder. And people would say, okay, well, that's equality. But we can't actually get to equality without dealing with the equity um, and providing the tools that people need in order to have access. That is addressing equity. And then eventually we see that that brings about justice. So I want to talk a little bit as we're about to close about how another ways that we can address inequity, meaning that the addressing the situations um, or the constructs that led to inequality. So let me start with you, Marsha. What are some ways do you think that we can address inequity?
Couldn't you make more space for voices that are not heard from to be heard? And even if there's no particular space or event for that to happen, remember that when you're together, to seek those voices out and include them.
Yeah, and Nicholas, what are your thoughts about addressing inequity?
Well, let me put one actually example. I was reading with you this lovely presentation, and I see when we speak about these no land release of cultural trails or checkoff. Uh, for example, if someone is see this video in this moment and he doesn't speak English, but very well, but understand a little bit, like me, and we see this video. Um, for example, I don't know what doesn't mean no land release. Maybe it's an idiom that I couldn't understand. So if we do the the effort to explain what doesn't mean, we are thinking in these terms of equity because I know English, but I don't know all the idioms, so I don't know what doesn't mean no land release of cultural. Can you explain?
Yes, just a list of things that we have done to show that we are culturally aware. Like you may say, well, I'm culturally aware because I have, number one, gone to festivals. Number two, some of my best friends are Black or Latino. Number three, I studied Buddhism so that I can have this understanding. That's a laundry list. There's nothing wrong
Okay.
with doing those things, but it brings back the point that cultural awareness is a lifelong journey. So you don't just make a list of things that you've done and say, well, now I'm culturally aware and culturally humble because here is the list or the laundry list that I've created to show that.
Thank you for the explanation.
Of course.
And well, like I see, so if we must to we are speaking all these moment that always recheck or how we could be more accessible to everyone, give more equity in, for example, I ask you about the understanding because not all have the same skill to understand everything, even what we are reading.
Hmm. And one of the ways that we can address equity in putting on these webinars is, having captions in Spanish, having sign language so that there are those who um, may have a difficulty understanding English, especially the different English idioms, which it can be hard even if you're very fluent in English.
Thank you. But doing this exercise, I know. I think, for example, this video is difficult to put in all the language. But for example, if someone do the effort to hear in English, if we use like I say, like some slang or some idiom, I think is the word. Well, put
Mhm.
this asterisk there in the below part of the. That's mean that thing.
That is a very valid point, Nicholas. I totally agree
Because
with
I
you.
know I learned another new idiom like laundry list. I know what does it mean.
You're right. So that just gives us something else to work on in this lifelong journey of education and understanding. So very valid point. So I want to thank you two for taking the time to meet with me and have this discussion. This is a workshop I've given before, but I'd like getting different points of views because all of our points of views are shaped by our experiences, right? So I wanted to hear about the different experience and point of views of cultures that differ from my own. So I appreciate you two being a part of this, and look forward to working together again on something like this, um, with the Under the Rope series, and rope being racial oppression awareness program, and under that is where we have the Rainbow Racism series, directly addressing these issues, these biases, these imbalances that take place within our own community. So I think this has been quite informative, and thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for the opportunity to share what we've learned and are still learning.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much to Richard. And let me put another thing that we can do in our events around the world, um, about the equity. Maybe maybe always maybe this recommendation is for sort of to say privilege pride, that when you make the events, we always must to know that not everyone. I know many events must to be paid because the production is huge, but never forget to, in this case, always has events for free,
Hmm.
because not everyone in your city will have the capacity to celebrate paying. I'm not saying VIP entrance. I'm not saying that. I saying maybe even a regular entrance for a festival. Maybe not all people can access and have the experience. So don't forget to have events that we not without charge to entrance.
Hmm.
uh, Always remember that, because in your city, maybe there's some LGBT person, maybe a refugee who doesn't are in the position to spend even $10, $5 to entrance, just to celebrate with you.
Very valid point. Something to absolutely think about. Thank you so much, and I hope you two enjoy the rest of your day.
You as well.